A few years ago, a typhoon hit the city. The rain wasn't heavy, but the wind was strong enough to tear shingles off roofs. With its particularly strong gust, a stone picked up by the typhoon struck the window on the balcony and shattered it. While I tried to do something to protect the room from the wind blowing through, I ended up cutting my legs and arms on the shards. The damage wasn't severe, aside from the broken window glass. I was really scared at the time, but the strangeness began later. The next day, I called a team of workers to replace the broken window with a new plastic one. I live on the 8th floor, so the guys had to work at a height they were used to it though. To avoid getting in their way, I decided to go to the store. I returned in 15 minutes. There was a real panic on the floor, and the epicenter was my apartment. Rushing inside, I learned that one of the window installers had fallen and died. What really happened, no one could quite explain. He just fell. I won't go into details about the subsequent investigations. I tried to forget this incident as soon as possible. The other day, on the first day off after a work week, I was at home. After preparing lunch and tidying up, I decided to relax in the bath. Just as I started to unwind, I heard the sound of breaking glass. Wrapped in a towel and rushing into the living room, I stared at the TV it was on, even though I hadn't approached it for several days. Leaning over to unplug it, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed some movement. Quickly turning around, I saw a black kitten. I wasn't concerned about how the animal got into the apartment at the time, but I needed to get rid of it. Chasing after it, I didn't immediately notice how I cut my legs on the glass shards lying by the window. But where did they come from if the window was intact? Studying the window, I caught sight of the person standing below directly under my window. Staring at him, I recognized the tanned, shaggy man in work clothes who had fallen from my window. He, in turn, was staring intently at me, located on the 8th floor. What it was, I don't know, and I don't want to know. But since that day, I've been a bit scared to be alone in my apartment in the evenings. All this horror happened to me at my grandmother's country house when I was quite young. I had come to visit my grandparents, and I was alone in the room. Getting ready for bed, I turned off the light. But there was a mirror in my room, a big one, where you could see the door. I didn't bother to close the door, and as I glanced into the mirror, it was already dark, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow pass by. It became scary. I thought, what else might I see in the darkness? I lay down, and out of boredom, I looked into the mirror again. Another shadow. I was so scared that my legs trembled. Then I heard footsteps, very quiet, like a cat walking. But I knew the cat was indoors. The dog was indoors too, and snails can't walk, especially since it was in a terrarium. I lay there, scolding myself. The footsteps approached. I fell silent. The footsteps stopped, then turned around and disappeared somewhere near the window. I shook for another 5 minutes, then watched TV all night. The next day, as I prepared to go to bed, I saw the shadow in the mirror again. Footsteps. In short, my grandfather also heard the footsteps, but he thought it was me sneaking to the fridge. I couldn't take it anymore, so I left home because of this fear. Since then, I have been haunted by a strange feeling that someone is standing behind me. Hello, dear lovers of mysticism. My name is Maria, I'm 15. It all started just a couple of months ago. One fine day, my parents went to visit friends at their country house, so I had the house to myself for 2 to 3 days. It was late, around 1 in the morning. I crawled under the covers and fell asleep right away. And it's about that dream that I wanted to tell you. I found myself in my room. It was very cold. I pulled the blanket around me and looked around me. Sitting on a chair about 2 meters from my bed was a person, a man of normal build, wearing a dark suit. I couldn't see his face, he was in the shadows. I felt a strange feeling, fear mixed with tranquility, or even calmness. Finally, I decided to speak. "Who are you?" I asked. "I have many names," the man replied in a slightly hoarse voice. "Are you the devil?" I felt my voice trembling. "Yes, that's one of them." I even thought he smirked as he said those words. We continued talking. I don't remember what we talked about, only that he was telling me something, and I was listening attentively. I remember he said that all my recent successes are connected to him. He said he wants to help, but he doesn't do anything for free. Later, I understood what he wanted. This conversation lasted quite a long time. He fell silent. Then he said it was time for him to go. Suddenly, his face was in front of mine, and I noticed his eyes. They were like two smoldering coals, like a void pulling me in. And then I blacked out. When I opened my eyes, it was dark. It was 4:18 on the clock. I couldn't fall asleep until morning. I was thinking about what had happened. The story is based on real events from my life. Thanks for your attention. Whether to believe it or not is up to you. See you later. In Ireland, it used to be customary to make coffins with holes into which a 3-meter copper tube with a bell on the end was inserted. The tube allowed people who were mistakenly declared dead and buried to breathe, and with the help of the bell, they could signal for help. One night, Harold, a gravedigger in a small town, heard the bell ringing and went to check if it was once again the mischief of children. Sometimes the bells rang because of strong winds, but not this time. A muffled female voice from below begged Harold to dig up the grave. "Are you Sarah Owahoanan?" Harold clarified. "Yes," came the muffled voice. "Were you born on September 17, 1827? "Yes." "The tombstone says you died on February 20th, 1857. "No, I'm alive." "There's been a mistake. Please dig me up." "I'm sorry, ma'am," said Harold, breaking the bell and burying the copper tube with dirt. "It's already August, and whatever you are down there, damn it, you're no longer alive and you won't get out of there." Long ago, my mother worked as a nurse. In the therapeutic department of her hospital, there was often a guy in his 30s lying there. His name was Jack. He had a very large heart, a congenital defect. The guy was very handsome and cheerful. And one day, into this hospital, right after finishing nursing school, came to work a young 18-year-old girl. The new nurse's name was Lana. She often visited her friends in the therapeutic department, where she saw Jack. Lana really liked him, and he began to show signs of attention, giving her flowers, perfume. And one day he put a ring on her finger and said, "Marry me." And Lana joked back, "But you're always sick. You'll die and I'll be left alone." And he replied, "I won't leave you alone. I'll take you with me." They bantered like that all the time when he was in the hospital. But a few months later, Jack was no more. His sick heart couldn't take it. It stopped. And then, 2 months later, some drunkard stabbed Lana when she was going on a call. She had 12 stab wounds on her body. The whole hospital gathered for the funeral, carrying the coffin on their shoulders for over 5 kilometers to the cemetery. Lana lay in the coffin in a white dress, like a bride. But when they arrived at the cemetery, everyone got goosebumps. Her grave was dug next to Jack's. So they buried her next to her groom. This is the story of my older sister. We have a country house. and nearby there is a cemetery approximately 500 meters away, quite large in size. Many creepy things happened at the country house, but this story is the most memorable. Behind the fence of the country settlement, there was a forest, and there they arranged something like a playground, installed a ping pong table, swings, etc. My sister at that time, about 16 to 17 years old, often hung out there with her country friends. They went there with a friend to listen to music loudly, so as not to disturb anyone, play cards. Next to the gate was a fence separating the country house from the forest. To get to the playground, they had to crawl under the gate on their stomachs, as there was a lock on it, and everything else was dense forest. So, they were sitting, laughing, and my sister heard strange sounds in the forest, as if a bunch of squirrels were climbing onto one tree. There was no wind, and she got scared. She suddenly stood up, turned off the music, and told her friend that they needed to leave, pretending that their relatives would soon be looking for them for lunch. They climbed over and moved away from the fence, but both froze at the same time, watching what was happening. Something tree-like of gigantic proportions began to move through the forest, as if gliding, across the entire playground next to the table where they were sitting. They don't know how long it lasted, but they looked at each other and rushed home. This was about 13 years ago, but they still keep in touch and recount with real horror what they saw, swearing to everyone that it is a real story, which they still cannot find a logical explanation for. Well, hello everyone. I'm someone who suffers from hallucinations. Unfortunately, the problem with this hasn't been solved. I've just gotten used to it and I deal with it normally. Though experiencing sleep paralysis isn't very pleasant, the sensations are quite something. It all started from childhood. I got interested in various scary stories, like creepypasta and similar stuff. I liked the drawings from there, but because of that, I got acquainted with death files. It really hit my child's psyche hard that I saw such things, and I still do. At first, I used to talk about it to my close ones, but they always blamed it on the internet. Even though it was my friends who introduced me to all of this, and later on, they would make fun of me for my cowardice. It was scary to sleep, and to look into dark corners my brain thought there was something scary there, and it still does to this day. The scariest of these creatures was Smile Dog. His bloody version gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. Even though it's just a picture of a poor husky that was so disfigured, it's hard to believe it's photoshopped. It was in 2020 when I still lived in a small urban-type settlement, and there was a prison there. The town wasn't that big, so I don't think they would have built a prison right in the town, right? Anyway, someone either escaped from there or they couldn't catch him and put him there. I didn't delve into the details. At that time, I still had an old group of friends from there, with whom we used to hang out every day. It was summer, so there were no difficulties with that. And it was already dark, but our parents allowed us to hang out until 11 p.m. because the settlement was small and everyone knew each other. So we were hanging out near our local school when one of our friends accidentally made an obscene gesture towards a passing car, flipped up the middle finger. But suddenly, about 30 meters away from us, the car stopped, and some adult guy with a shovel started walking towards us. We all ran, and thankfully we managed to escape. The next day, when we were hanging out around the same time almost, one of us noticed the same car again. We all got scared and went to the nearest well-maintained 3-story building and hid in the entrance. It was our friend's house, so he had the keys. We went up to the top floor and looked out the window, a stupid move, and waited for him to leave. He kept turning his headlights on and off, as if letting us know that he was still here, and then, after about 30 minutes, he drove away. We couldn't shake off the situation for a long time afterward and were scared of every passing burgundy car. We never saw him again. One day around the age of 11, I was home alone. At that time, I was a fervent fan of all things mystical and paranormal. So I decided to watch the then popular pony creepypasta called Mirror in short. This creepypasta talks about how you and your reflection are not the same. There were several ways to prove this to yourself. For example, turn off the light, quickly cut a lock of your hair, turn the light back on, and compare the length of the locks. If you notice that the lengths do not match, don't show any signs. Pretend that everything is fine and calmly step away from the mirror. Now it knows that you know. Of course, I understood that it was all made up, but as I mentioned, I was very interested in it all. So after watching that video, some time passed, and I decided to make faces in front of the mirror, already completely forgetting about that video. Sometimes I get nervous tics, and my head can turn either right or left without warning. This case was one of those moments. I was fooling around, dancing, and then my head suddenly turned to the right due to a nervous tic, and I almost instantly turned my head back, and oh my God, I swear I saw my reflection still looking to the right. But literally a second later, it was looking back at me again, and I felt a stranger's gaze upon me, as if they were looking straight into my soul. I instantly remembered about that creepypasta and stepped away from the mirror. I was afraid to approach them until late at night when my mom came home from work. I have another creepy story when I was home alone with a friend, but it's also very long and won't fit into this post. My story isn't particularly unusual. It happened last year. One summer day, like always, I spent the whole day sitting at my computer. It was around 11:30 on the clock. After some sweaty rounds of Dead by Daylight, I went to bed, and I fell asleep. I began to have a nightmare about being trapped in a backstage area and wandering around it. Monsters were constantly chasing me, and when I tried to wake up, it turned out to be another dream. I realized this because I found myself back in the backstage area again. This happened repeatedly, but time seemed to speed up. Eventually, I actually woke up. But no, it was still a dream. I was desperate. It was a nightmare. I couldn't wake up because I kept ending up in the backstage area. Eventually, the dream took a darker turn, and I wasn't just ending up in the backstage area anymore, something was just scaring me. Sometimes claws would emerge from the floor, dragging me into the water. Sometimes it turned out I was living in the Truman Show, and so on. In the end, I woke up at 2 o'clock. I thought it was just another nightmare, but nothing happened. I just went about my usual day sitting at the computer and later decided to go for a walk and do some sports. This story may be bleak, but I was terribly frightened that I couldn't wake up. And to this day, I can't figure out if it was all a big dream or if it was real life. When I was 9 to 10 years old, I was brought to my grandmother's house for the holidays. The first 2 days were fine. I ate pastries and watched TV. On the third day, I started noticing shadows at night, as if a black figure appeared for 1 second with a big nose. Its skin was dark, with long hair, and it would strike various scary poses. Then the TV broke. Someone pressed something wrong, and the TV was old, and the remote disappeared, and they suspected me. After a long search, my grandmother suddenly called me into another room and told me that it might have been a house spirit. I didn't believe it, but then I remembered the shadows. Grandma said we had to appease it by giving it milk, so we did. She also said, play a little, then return it the next day. The TV fixed itself, and the milk was gone. Hello everyone, the story is short but still gives me goosebumps. Here's the story. My mom, dad, and my 2 brothers were sleeping in the same room. When I fell asleep, I dreamt that I woke up at 3 in the morning home alone, and the light was on in the distant room. Naturally, I went to turn it off, but as soon as I turned around, the light turned on again. I didn't think much of it since it was a dream. I lay down on the bed and looked into the corridor as the light turned on in another room. The light illuminated the corridor wall perfectly, and then 2 shadows ran along the wall, and all the lights went out. Immediately, I woke up in a state of shock. For those who don't know what a state of shock is, it's when you feel intense panic and can't move your limbs and breathe heavily. I woke up and couldn't move or breathe properly. Eventually, the feeling passed. Everyone else in the room was asleep, and as if nothing had happened, I fell asleep again. When I was 7 to 8 years old, I went for a walk with my 4 friends. We were walking for more than 4 hours and got really thirsty, but our homes were far away, about 3 to 4 kilometers. We decided to go drink from a spring. As we were almost there, we saw a strange man standing by the spring. He stood there motionless for about 2 minutes and then started drinking water. We waited for him to leave because it wasn't a good idea to approach the spring while he was there. We waited on a small hill. After he finished drinking, he walked away. Then, at one point, he started circling around us and climbed the hill behind us. We didn't notice this until I turned around and saw him climbing up with a knife and a rope. I shouted, "Run!" 2 of my friends started running, while the third thought it was a joke, but after a few seconds, he turned around and saw the man approaching him, so he started running too. 2 of my friends ran in one direction, and I ran with another friend in another direction. The man lost track of us and went after the other 2. Those 2 friends found themselves in a dead end. When the man ran after them, he slipped in the mud. They took advantage of the moment, jumped over him, and ran towards us. The 4 of us hid in the bushes. He passed by us, and after 10 minutes, we went back home after a brief conversation. This happened quite recently, about 3 months ago, during the night. I was sitting and watching TV, and after about 2 hours, I started to doze off. The TV was talking about foxes when I began to fall asleep. I heard a creaking noise from the dresser, even though it was locked. I was 12 years old at the time. I covered myself with a blanket and started to think that it was my parents who had opened it, but then I heard my younger sister crying and the sound of my mom and dad waking up. I was very scared at that moment. When I looked at the dresser, it was still closed. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I was playing on my phone when I heard something in the wardrobe. I was 13 at the time, and this happened 8 days ago at night. When I wanted to open the wardrobe, the light flickered as in horror stories, and I got goosebumps. I ran to get my dad's bat. When I came back to open the wardrobe and swung it open, there was no one inside, but I definitely heard a sound. After that incident, I don't open the wardrobe. I know it could have been a sound from a game, but I was too scared. I grew up in an old village where you could see the police maybe once a week, and they were unlikely to help you. One night, when I was feeling really bored, I went out for a walk, and it turned out to be a mistake. When I had walked about 100 meters away from home, I felt someone's gaze in the complete darkness where there was no one around. There were some rustlings nearby, but I didn't pay much attention to them. But I had to approach because I had dropped a valuable coupon. In our village, with one coupon at the beginning of 2010, you could easily buy something worth up to $10. When I approached to pick up the coupon, I realized why I had felt like someone was watching me. There was a man who looked around 40 and was 2 meters tall, and 2 little girls about 11 years old. I myself was about to turn 15 in a month. Looking at them, I could see that they were clearly together. When the man saw me, he didn't leave me alone. After a second, I felt some relief, as if my body had become light. When I woke up, I couldn't even scream from the pain. I was tightly bound, and the rope was cutting into my wrists. Without going into details, they did terrible things to me. At that moment, barely alive, I felt the cloth covering my eyes slip off, and I saw only that man walking away in the distance. I clearly remembered him and what he had done to me. After that incident, of course, my parents started asking what had happened to me, and to avoid further questioning, I said that I had fought against a crowd and failed. Soon I was taken to the hospital, where I was diagnosed with nephroptosis when the kidney is not in its place. And I knew why I still had indentations on that spot from the rope. Luckily, at least the other kidney wasn't damaged. After that moment, I turned 18 and moved to the city for studies. While on the 3rd year of college, surrounded by good friends, one day I went to a not very popular bar with one of my friends. Although I wasn't a fan of alcohol myself, as I became actively involved in sports and wrestling after moving to the city, I decided to accompany my friend. In the end, he got drunk, and I had to drive him home. When we left the bar, I heard a very familiar voice. I sat my friend in the back seat and said I would be back in a minute, leaving him. I looked around and saw the man with a stature like a pillar and a very familiar voice, heading towards an alley, apparently to relieve himself. Remembering my childhood trauma and with a desire for revenge, I went after him. Fortunately, he was alone there, and there was no ambush. When I saw him, I was sure it was him. I couldn't restrain myself and started beating him, over and over again, with whatever came to hand, even with a pipe lying near a garbage bin. I didn't give myself a second to talk to him. The outcome of this story is that when I had already got into the car and left, a guy from the bar called an ambulance, and the man was taken to the hospital. He had a lot of wounds on his body, and he fell into a long coma due to a skull injury. His chances of survival were lower than those of a person with cancer. And I wasn't weakened in any way.